For this year's tour, we decided to head to Sturgis. I started in Calgary and went to Swift Current, which is where my father lived, and from there we headed south down into Deadwood, and that's where we would stay, which is only about 20 miles outside of Sturgis. Since we were in the vicinity, we thought we'd check out a couple other things while we were there. We saw Chief Crazy Horse, the Needles Highway, a bunch of other stuff in there. When we left, we headed west and went through Thermopolis and Yellowstone. You can't pass up Yellowstone, it's gorgeous. From there we headed north up into Montana. We went over the Going to the Sun Road and eventually back up to Calgary to end our tour. Great time was had. Once again, I did not have a video camera for this trip. All I have are still pictures, but I think there's lots of stuff to see. South of Malta, we rode about a 20-mile stretch of highway that was absolutely covered in grasshoppers. Dad was leading, and as he would ride, all the grasshoppers would fly up, and of course I would come along behind him and just plow right into them. I had to back off about a half a mile in order to keep from eating all these things. You can see from the picture of my bike here that we got covered in this stuff, and we had to find a car wash when we got to Deadwood and try and get some of this goop off. For most of our day of riding, we didn't see a whole lot of bikes. Once we got through Crow Agency in Montana, we started to see a lot more bikes piling up. In fact, the crowds got heavier and heavier until we got to Devil's Tower. We were still 75 miles out, but there was a lot of bike traffic at this point. It was actually a lot of fun to see. After a long day of riding and walking around Deadwood, it was time to sit back, grab a drink, and take in some of the sights. For the next day, we were heading off to Sturgis. Sturgis is a really fun place. People bring down bikes of all makes and models down there, and a lot of people bring down these custom things. There's people who put radial airplane engines in their bikes, to companies like Boss Haas that put big V8s in their bikes. Another guy had the back end of a '59 Cadillac in order to make a giant trike, which was really cool. Another guy used his kid's vintage tricycle as inspiration for his own build. And I believe underneath all of this fur and horns is an old Victory bike. You run into other ones who think that, one V8 just isn't quite enough, you gotta have two in there. And of course, finally, this is the hearse I want to be taken to my final resting place in. As fun as Sturgis is, you have to take a day and tour through the surrounding area. The Black Hills have so much scenic beauty to offer. I only have 2 good pictures of me with my father. Both of them were taken on this trip. Here's the first one. You can't go down to Sturgis without traveling the Needles Parkway. The scenery down there is amazing. They have some really cool tunnels that have been cut through the rock, but they're so tight they only allow for one-way traffic. This is also the backdrop for where I got the second of 2 good pictures I have with my father. After touring all the local scenery, we headed back to Sturgis to find ourselves a cold beer. As we were walking down the street, somebody reached out of the crowd and grabbed my father, and I thought, wonderful, we are getting in a fight. Turns out, it was actually somebody my dad used to work with years before, and we had the fortune of running into them in Sturgis of all places. So we went inside, had a cold beer, and took in some of the sights. After 2 days in Sturgis, it was time to hit the road. Now 2 days is barely enough to even scratch the surface in Sturgis, but it was all the time we had, so it was time to go. We headed west to Thermopolis, and on our way there we went up over the Powder River Pass and through a scenic byway on Highway 16, which was absolutely spectacular. Thermopolis is famous for its therapeutic hot pools. I believe, being as close as it is to Yellowstone, that the hot water comes from the same volcanic system that heats Yellowstone. This water is absolutely laden with minerals. You'll see it overflowing the riverbanks and everything. In fact, there's one picture here where it's supposed to be a fountain, but it's so covered with minerals you can't tell what it is anymore. We had stayed the night in Cody, and in the morning we headed west on Highway 14 into Yellowstone. One thing that we were not aware of was the amount of elevation we were going to gain going into Yellowstone. We were getting over 8,500 feet in some areas, and it was cold, something we were not prepared for as it had been so hot in the Black Hills. The Sulpher Cauldron is essentially boiling battery acid. A couple years ago, somebody decided to go off the path and fell in, and essentially he was dissolved. There was no body to recover, so stay on the pathways. We only had about a half a day in Yellowstone, which was not enough time. However, we had more sights to see, so it was time to get moving. The Going to the Sun Road, which is in Glacier National Park in Montana, is a spectacular drive. The one downfall of it is it does get very congested in the summer, which means you have to drive slow. Which is okay, that gives you a little bit of time to look at all the scenery. Fortunately on this trip, we were able to get into the visitor center at the top, but a lot of times it is so crowded that you can't get in there as they close the parking lot off. And so concludes another Wright Men tour of Mayhem. The trip my father and I had taken the year before, we found our footing and felt like we could do a bigger trip. So we did a very big trip. We did Deadwood and Sturgis, we went over to Yellowstone, we did the Going to the Sun Road. A lot of it was challenging riding as the roads were very busy and there was lots of twists and turns. After doing a trip this big, we felt like there wasn't really much that we couldn't tackle, so we kept planning trips for years to come. Here's looking forward to the next year.